They came to the city under a moon like a broken coin, the sky crowded with high thin cloud and the smell of the river clinging to every plank and leather strap. Robb Stark sat his gray courser in the shadows of the Kingswood while the last of the outriders slid back through the trees. Gray wind ghosted between the stouter oaks, a darker slippage inside the dark, and when the dire wolf returned he pressed his muzzle up into Robb's palm as if to say the way ahead was as he had left it, uncertain and edged with hidden teeth. The Blackfish drew up beside him, his mail muffled with felt. Our Crownland's men swear the gate captain will play his part. His purse is heavy as a Lannister's conscience. Is it heavy enough to outweigh his fear? Robb asked, quiet. Beneath them, the moon-paled road ran toward the King's City with its countless lamps guttering behind a skin of fog. Somewhere, faint as memory, a bell told a late hour. Robb could taste tar and salt, the reek of fish. The city was breathing in its sleep. Brynden Tully's teeth flashed. Men who have lost honor will not find it at a city gate. He will take his coin. He will take his chance. And we will do the rest. Robb closed his fist around the wolf's ear and let out a slow breath. He had seen too many chances and too much coin these past months. The war had taught him the cost of both. He raised his hand and the shadow-hushed column behind him. A river of leather, wool, steel, seemed faces and silent standards, shifted as a current moves when a stone is lifted from the bed. Signal the Great John, Robb said. We go. They rode with the trees pressed to their left, hugging the shoulder of the road. The woods thinned and the ditch deepened. When the earth rose, the city rose with it, the curtain walls gleaming like damp bone. He saw the towers with their iron-spiked crowns. He saw the lanterns and the silhouettes of men on the battlements. Above all, he saw where the land fell to the river and the tight clustering of roofs at the base of the mud gate. The Blackwater lapped and licked at a shape in the water that was not a moored ship or a barge, something long and low near the far bank. A chain, he thought suddenly, and his mouth went dry. The talk from their Crownland scouts had not been idle then. Tyrion Lannister was building cunning as other men built keeps. Gray wind lifted his head and growled a warning so soft that only Robb felt it vibrate through his glove. A rider drifted out of the line of knotted trees and threw up a hand. It was the man from Rosby, the one whose brother wore a gold cloak. He rode like a man who had not yet made up his mind to live or die. The Blackfish caught his bridle and leaned in. Words passed between them like hands offered and withheld. The Blackfish wheeled his horse. The King's Gate, he said, voice flat. The captain was persuaded by a better offer. Another purse? Robb asked. My promise that his children will see morning. The Blackfish's eyes were iron in the dark. And coin. We are not septons. Robb looked at the city again. The moon slipped from a cloud, and in that pale wash Robb saw something he had thought about and feared. The gates held by men who would open them for one king at midnight and close them for another at dawn. He thought of the small folk sleeping, of mothers with the sweet milk smell of infants on their gowns, of men who would wake to a different banner snapping over the city, and not know if their day's bread would cost less or more, or if the word for bread would change and cost them everything. He thought of his father, who had died because a city could be opened by whispers. He put his hand to the bronze ring of his gorget and felt the chill of the metal sink into his skin. We'll go to the King's Gate, he said. Quietly, they sent the horse archers ahead 2 by 2, vanishing into the ditches like night birds. The glow in the sky sharpened as they neared the city's edge. The low, drunk murmur of kings landing rose like a tide. He smelled roasting meat and piss and smoke and the sour tang of tanneries. The road widened. The wall loomed. The King's Gate, broad and iron-bound, sat in its own stone throat. Torches sputtered atop its flanking towers. A figure leaned out over the parapet, ladder slim. Throw down the rope, the Blackfish called softly. No names, the figure whispered back. The captains want no names. Names are for men who intend to keep them, the Blackfish murmured. The rope came down. Men climbed. The first was a boy from Carhold, pale as milk but quick as a wagtail. Others followed, hand over hand, breath puffing white. Robb's turn came. He left Grey Wind with the Great John below, the direwolf's bristling back pressed to his greaves a heartbeat before Robb slipped out of reach. The rope was coarsely tarred, and his palms burned as he made the top. The parapet smelled of smoke and fear. The captain of the watch, no more than 30, his stubble the color of old straw, stood with his men in a tight knot, eyes skittering between Robb's face and the dark beneath his feet. "Do it," the captain told the keyman. The keyman's hands were shaking so hard that he had to hold his wrist to steady it while struggling with the ring burst. The gate bars creaked, loud as crows. Robb felt the world narrow in his chest. That noise could call others. That noise could bring every lantern and blade in the city. Below, the Great John drew breath and bellowed one long wolf howl that seemed to spring from the stones. Men surged. Grey Wind leapt the ditch in one clean sail and vanished with the first wave. They passed through under the iron teeth while the Blackfish's voice was a low knife cutting order into the dark. Straight for the fishmonger's square. Left at the bell tower. No torches. No shouting until the Red Keep's walls are fixed in your eyes. The first man who sets hand to a door for plunder will lose it at the wrist, and I will see the stump caw. Tear-eyed with a hot helm as my father taught me. Robb felt the city swallow them like bread dipped in broth. The air changed. The smell was closer. Onions and boiled grain and human breath. Somewhere to his left a baby was crying. Somewhere to his right a man's voice, thick with drink, raised in a song about a goose. They moved in a long black eel shaped to the alleys, and twice they halted tight against a wall while a patrol of gold cloaks hurried past without looking into the dark. They broke into the fishmonger's square and the night widened. A ship's bell rang on the river. The glimmer that Robb had taken for a chain lay closer now, its cogs and teeth hidden in the water's bloom, and for a moment he thought of the men who would have labored to forge such a thing. Big-armed smiths wincing their eyes against sparks, boys hauling rod and pin, a clever dwarf pacing a plan across a floor with his hands behind his back. Tyrion Lannister's craft was all over this city. It had a kind of beauty, that craft. Robb respected it and hated it all at once. From the river the road reared toward the hill, and the Red Keep rose above the city like a clenched fist. The Blackfish's hand came up. "Now," he said. The first cry that split the night was not wolfish but human. A shock of bronze on bronze as Northmen banged swords on shields and the echoes began their work. Down alleys, up windows, along the spine of the city. Men came awake. The gold cloaks turned in bafflement. Who to kill? Which way to run? The captain at the King's Gate had quieted his own post. But at the foot of the hill a second watch post bristled into readiness at the wrong instant and loosed a rash volley that arced into their own dark like swallows. The Northmen were already past, flowing around the base of a stone edifice and up the street that led to the Red Keep's main sally port. On the walls, alarm bells lurched into clamor. At the mud gate the slaughter of a fish vendor by a panicked cloak turned a ripple into a spray. A shutter banged back overhead and a woman's face appeared, hair netted, eyes wide, a candle shaking light onto her cheek. "King in the north!" the Great John roared, and the cry leapt from mouth to mouth and rose up the hill like a fire climbs a dry thatch. When the first stones came down from the Sallyport machicolations, the men beneath raised their shields in a kneeled turtle. The Blackfish had placed the men with precision. Iron-rimmed shields in front, archers behind, climbers by the postern to the right where Varys's whisper had assured a key lay sleeping in a lock seldom turned. Grey Wind bounded ahead, till he hit the line of oil and steel and hissed, stopping, hackles making him vast. The defender's captain shouted for more oil. An instant later an arrow went through his throat and he tumbled backward with a wet sound that made the nearest man retch. Robb took a step forward into the spill of light beneath the Sallyport. "This city is taken," he called, and his voice sounded like another man's in his ear, older, colder. "Yield the keep and your lives are your own. Stand, and the wolf will eat the lion's cubs and their friends and leave your wives to weep without you." A shape moved on the wall. "Who speaks?" came a voice that tried to be brave and landed between anger and fear. "Who speaks treason at the King's Gate?" "A king," the Great John said softly behind Robb and began to laugh. The Blackfish's climbers went up the postern like spiders. gray wind sprang up slope, a pale flash against red stone, and the men above faltered as the beast's shadow leapt on their faces. The lock yielded. The postern's iron keel scraped, and the door's breath came cool and stale. They were inside the throat of the Red Keep. Robb had never been inside these walls. He had imagined them 100 times. As a boy at his father's knee, as a commander at war tables with pin-pricked maps, as a king under starlight. The actuality was narrower. The corridor smelled of damp rope and old oil and the faint, sweet reek of mice. They moved as they had to, shoulders brushing, heads ducked. A man ahead of Robb coughed softly once and fought the urge to cough again, his body shaking like a wire plucked by a cruel finger. The passage spat them into a stairwell and then another. Caution was a thing with weight. It dragged at Robb's boots. He thought of his father's last walk up bright steps into a throne room thick with torchlight and lies. He saw Catelyn's hands fixing his gorget that morning, her eyes as cool as a lake in shade. "Don't love the walls," she had murmured. "Love the men who must cross them for you." On the second landing, the first clash began in earnest. Kingsguard, or men wearing white cloaks, filled the corridor beyond the arch with a sudden scatter of light from falling flambeaux. Robb did not know the face beneath the helm, only the sure work of a sword in a well-fed hand. The man in white cut down one of the Karstark boys and was reaching to skewer the next when gray wind slammed him from the side so violently his head cracked the stone edge. The direwolf's teeth closed on the man's throat. The corridor smelled of hot iron and blood. The Northman surged, stepping over the fallen boy, the boy who would never see green summer again, who had kissed a girl behind a tent after the whispering trees outside the twins. Robb felt sudden nausea as he shoved forward, and behind it the hard bit of need. If he falters here, all the men who had marched behind his banner would have marched for nothing but a mournful song. They fought stair by stair. A man in a sigil Robb didn't recognize, small-scale broadcloth gilded with a nonce lion, went hard at the Blackfish and caught a point in the thigh for his trouble. Brynden Tully did not grunt. He did not curse. He only cut the man on his return stroke neatly and stepped aside as he fell. Robb climbed, blade moving, breath steadying into the work. He remembered for one instant the SL. Ope of Winterfell's inner steps, worn into shallow bowls by generations of Northmen's boots. He remembered racing Arya to the top while Bran laughed with both hands clapping, and Sansa scolded them for their noise. Then the world was only the next step and the next breath, the press of shoulders, the wet slap of someone's hand against stone as he went down. They burst into the light of an inner yard, and the yard burst into them. Household guards, white cloaks, men-at-arms with lion shields, and behind them women clutching children and trays of jugs, singers without their harps, skittering pages. Panic was a shape with 100 feet, and they all tried to run across the yard at once. The Great John took a flying cut at a white cloak and drove him back to the well mouth, howling. Gray wind bounded past Robb and snapped at a man's calf. The man screamed and dropped a halberd that fell ringing like a bell. "Maegor's Holdfast," the Blackfish said. "They will hole there and make a parley of it." "And the Queen?" Robb asked. Brynden lifted his chin. "She will be somewhere warm with wine. Then we keep the heat from her," Robb said, and turned to the archers. "String and loose at will. Aim for men who move with purpose. Let the others go." The archers did as they were told. It was cruel work. It was also merciful, understood in the only terms war extended. One of the Kingsguard made a stand at the base of the footbridge to Maegor's. Spear braced, face set. Gray wind would have leapt him, but the man kept the spear steady and set it into the direwolf's shoulder. Gray wind twisted, yelped, withdrew, and the white cloak grunted triumph into an opening. It was a stupid, human sound. Robb did not think. He stepped into the space and drove his sword through the gap at the man's armpit. The man's breath left him in a hoof. His spear fell and the iron tip clanged along the bridge's footings. The direwolf's blood looked black in the torchlight. "Hold," Robb told him, kneeling, and set his hand to the thick fur. Gray Wind's eyes were fever bright. Robb's fingers came away sticky, but the wound had not gone deep. The armor rib had turned it. He touched his brow to the animal's head once, done in an instant, and rose. Behind them a boy with a bowl haircut and the face of a petulant child yanked at his arm and shrieked at the women to move faster. Robb had seen his face on banners and coins. He had seen it through smoke above a long table where a red sword lay in oilcloth and Catelyn's mouth had pressed thin. Joffrey Baratheon, that was the name the boy called when he wanted the world to supply him with food or death. The boy glanced back over his shoulder and saw Robb. Their gazes met. The boy's chin jerked upward in instinctive contempt, a habit deeper than breath, and then something else came in behind it, the first real knowledge of danger. He tugged again, and a woman grabbed Tommen's cloak and pulled him along, sobbing. At the head of the bridge, Cersei Lannister turned in a blaze of hair and jewels, eyes bold, lips a tight line. "Stop them!" the great Jon bellowed. Arrows hopped along the planks like angry frogs. A woman fell with her palms slapping wood. Joffrey's scream scraped the air. The sound had a brittle edge. A line of gold cloaks tightened around the queen and her sons. A white cloak in front took an arrow through the sheet of his shield and stumbled, and another propped him with his body and kept moving. Maegor's iron gate yawed, and the queen's train contracted through like a snake into a tight hole in the wall. The portcullis began to grind. "Hold your shot," Robb said at once. "I want the bridge." It was done with the suddenness of a thrown knife. 2 Karstark men shimmied up under the bridge footings and wedged greased wedges into the grooves. 3 more hauled on the iron chain that drew the bridge up, and it spun free and jammed. The portcullis halted 3 feet from the stone lip and skidded there with a long metal cry. A Lannister man tried to shove it down with his shoulder and howled as the teeth chewed his pauldron. A white cloak seized the boy king and shoved him forward, through, over, under. The boy wriggled, dirty and panicked and alive. Cersei looked back through the bars at Robb and smiled at him with her mouth and cursed him with her eyes. "Take the yard," Robb said, "and bring me Tyrion Lannister if you find him alive." They took the yard. It passed into their hands with spasm and stutter, resistance folding back into the keep. A few lords of small houses laid down their swords when the wolf banner rose above the yard, and when the Blackfish's voice at the well announced that any man who wished to throw his steel at their feet would be led from the keep unharmed into the city to go wherever his frightened feet might carry him. It was half mercy and half tactic. The men who needed killing would not surrender, and the men who surrendered did not need killing. Robb stood under the shadow of Maegor's holdfast and considered the iron teeth, the weight of stone and steel, the thickness of the walls behind, and the lives bottled there. Cersei, Joffrey, Tommen, Sansa. He felt the last name like a touch. "Robb," a voice said from his shoulder. Sansa stood there with her hair in a simple loop, tendrils escaping in the damp. Her gown was torn at the sleeve. The bare skin showed the sureness of gooseflesh. She looked tireder, thinner, but her eyes were his sister's eyes. She held herself very still, as if a generous outbreath might make her wake up in a different place. She had no guard. She had had a dozen guards for months, and none had loved her all the way to this yard. "Sansa," he said, and all the iron in his body turned to warm water. He set a hand on her shoulder, and she did not fall. She was too proud and had been taught too well, but her breath hitched as if she'd been struck. "Don't kneel," Robb said quickly as she began to drop. "You are a wolf." His voice broke on the word. He drew her to him and hugged her by the shoulders, careful of her bones. Gray wind nosed at her hips and then sat by her shin and leaned into her as if he had recognized her scent in a crowd and had been waiting a long time to do only that. "Where is Arya?" Robb asked after a time, quiet into the space behind her ear. "I don't know," she swallowed. "I thought she was at the September with..." She swallowed again. "They said she was lost on the road. I have not seen her since father." She could not bring herself to say more. She did not need to. "We will find her," he said, out of hope and because he needed to say the words. He turned to the great Jon. "No assault today. We tighten this keep like we would a girth, inch by inch. I do not want Cersei Lannister dead on a spear by some fellow with a new scar wanting to be remembered. I want her to hear every sound we make take something from her." Stannis? The Blackfish said, almost idly, his eyes on the river, the sky, the shape of the eastern bay. He will come to find his stolen prize. Robb nodded. Tyrion, he said again, and turned to a captain of the guard. If he is in the city, he will try to rally the watch or sabotage our efforts or find a bottle. Find him first. They found the dwarf fast asleep in a room with scrolls and ink and a map pinned under knives. The chair was big enough for 3 of him. He snapped awake with the blade at his throat and blinked at the men around him and then at the banner over the door and then at Robb, who came into the room last, the Blackfish behind him like a sharp-edged shadow. Tyrion, Robb said. The dwarf rubbed his eyes and peered up as if Robb were something he had not expected to sprout here, like a lone pine in a field of barley. If you have come to kill me, your grace, I'd be grateful if you'd do it before I rouse enough to feel a proper dread. If I'd come to kill you, it would be because you did too much with too little time, Robb said. He was surprised to find that, while anger lived in him like a coal, there was something else beneath it. He remembered Tyrion at Winterfell in a fur cloak, fond of snow and honest enough to pity Bran. The memory was like a small fire in a dry house. We need to talk. That, Tyrion said cheerfully, is what every man in this city says before asking me for coin or fire. He looked around, noted the men's faces, the set of Robb's jaw. But you are not a man of this city and you are not asking me. You are telling me. He scratched his nose. The chain? You have noticed it? Robb said nothing. Tyrion smiled crookedly. Good. You are less likely to be surprised by it then. Stannis is sailing. Stannis is always sailing, Tyrion said. Even when he sleeps, some part of him is tacking into wind no one else can feel. He sat up with an effort. His feet did not reach the floor. You will be tempted to take the chain up and leave it. You will be tempted to pull it up and trap him. You will be tempted to melt the damn thing with wildfire and the men on it as well. He tilted his head. I think you won't. Robb looked at him. You know me that well? I know what you pretended to be when you were 12, running with that wolf at your heel in a courtyard that smelled of leather and apple tarts. You wanted to be your father, Tyrion said. We all of us wanted to be our fathers when we could still afford such arrogance. The coal inside Robb sank and flared. You will tell me what the alchemists have and where, he said. You will do it now. I can't burn a fleet and the river with this city so close to it. You can, Tyrion said blandly, but you won't, which is encouraging. He stretched his back and grimaced at a kink there. If I tell you where the wildfire sits and how much, you'll put men on it. And you'll feel safer, because you will have moved the danger into my hands from yours, Robb said. A cunning man is still a man. Tyrion sighed. A few thousand jars, he said, in cellars near the Guildhall of the Alchemists, in the arcades near the Mud Gate, in a few sheds that look like they're meant to house good barley bags but will explode quite nicely if a donkey looks at them hard. The city is a tinderbox. Be careful how loudly you breathe. He tapped the map. This is where the chain bites. If Stannis comes hard against it, he will be bottled and his ships will crush themselves. You have enough archers to make visiting this city unprofitable. You don't need fire. You do need discipline. You advise me because? Because I prefer you over Stannis, Tyrion said with a shrug that was almost delicate. And because I owe your brother. And because Cersei will be sweating in a chamber with no wine, and it is good for her to learn that there are limits to what a name can purchase. Robb eyed him. If I give you parole, will you go to the brothel like a proper Lannister, and then some ladder will let my men over the wall? If you give me parole, I will walk to the September and light a candle for the dead, Tyrion said, and something moved in his face that had not been there a moment before. Then I will come back and give you more good counsel until you grow bored with it and toss me back in a cell. We can make an excellent habit of it. The Blackfish snorted. Put him under watch, he said. He can be useful while plotting my demise. I'm not plotting your demise, Tyrion said mildly. I like you. You have a beautiful way with a knife. They set men on the wildfire. They set men on the chain towers with orders that no hand would raise or lower without direct command. They set men along the quays and the river stairs. They put bread and onions under watch and had bakers and butchers swear, as if before gods, that they would charge as they had yesterday and not a penny more. They put watch on the city's water cisterns and the wells and sent men to the September to tell the silent sisters there would be work and to ask the mother's men to open their kitchen stores to the small folk in lines, as long as the lines did not grow into an army that could not be cooled by words. They did this all through a long night and into the bruised blue of morning. And when the dawn came, Robb Stark stood on the inner curtain and looked east. Blackwater Bay lay like a length of hammered iron bent by a giant hand. The ships of King's Landing were bunched, nose to tail, as if they had been herded hard by a clever dog. Beyond, the sea was quiet in the way seas are before someone breathes on them. A few gulls circled indifferent. The world held its breath. Stannis came with the sun behind him. He came without heralds and without song. He came with oars and iron rungs and the clean, sharp lines of his ships. The Fury led, and Davos Seaworth stood upon her stern sheets with his hand on a rail planed by his own boy years. Melisandre stood near Stannis like a shadow that had remembered the trick of standing up. Stannis's face, carved from a harder block than other men's, looked into the morning as if it had sworn a private oath to break it. "They look surprised," Davos said softly. "They should be," Stannis said. "We are sane. Wolves' banners fly over the Red Keep," Melisandre said in a voice that hung in the air like smoke. "No estag, no lion." Stannis's mouth pressed thinner. "I will have what is mine," he said, "or I will tear it apart and bury it in the bay." Davos squinted at the chain towers, at the water's make. He had seen the way a harbor wept under a chain when flooded. He felt the old fear stir in his gut. "My lord, I know his trick," Stannis said, not unkindly. "We cut through tricks by sailing straight." He glanced to the women in red. "Do not summon what you offered me last night." Melisandre turned her face to him. "The shadow is hungry, lord. It knows kings." "I am not Renly," Stannis said. "I am awake and armored, and I am not a coward in my wife's bed. We will not murder in that fashion again when men can see us." His eyes went back to the city. "Light no candles for me, Davos. Light them for our enemies when the day gives us their faces." Atop the inner curtain, Robb felt the city's pulse thicken. His men lined the walls with their longbows, their shafts cut by hands that belonged to fathers and uncles who had taught other boys to cut other wood on other mornings. The great John walked along the parapet with a careless swagger that steadied those who saw it. The Blackfish was all angles and cool measures, his eye counting ships the way a miser counts coin. Sansa stood behind and to the left of her brother, half in shadow, a basket of water skins at her feet. She had insisted, "I won't hide with the ladies while men die who saved me," she had said. Robb had allowed what some part of him had wanted to forbid, and he had told the guardsmen near his sister that if any steel drew near her, their bodies would make the only difference that mattered. Tyrion appeared with a small cup. "Mint," he said, offering it, "for the breath." Robb drank and found his mouth taste suddenly of green and cool. He wiped his lower lip with the back of his hand and said, "Your chain, Lannister." Tyrion looked at the towers, at the men posted, at the levers oiled by his own order. "It belonged to the city even when I was busy becoming its father." Robb gave him a look. "You have a talent for making both friends and enemies in the same hour." "It saves time," Tyrion said. The first oar creaked within hearing like something from a long old dream. The Fury's prow cut the bright skin of water and left a white, clean wound. The smaller ships bunched behind. Black sails, common canvas, patched brown, gleam black pitch, the little bright flags a captain fixed for luck. Robb's hands found each other in a clasp and held without moving. A gull screamed once overhead. The sound felt like a laugh gone wrong. "Hold," the Blackfish murmured at his shoulder. "Hold now." The word went down the line of men like a spark runs a fuse. The first flight of Stark arrows leapt. They looked slow in the bright air. They were not. They fell on the first ranks of Stannis's vanguard like summer rain falling in a narrow valley where hay had been cut and left to dry. Men shouted and ducked and brought their shields up. Oars kept moving because a good crew learns the difference between dying and losing rhythm and knows which matters most. The fury kept coming. "Chain," Robb said. The men at the winches moved. The massive links rose under the river in a slow curve and then a higher one, water distorting at the surface before the metal broke through like the back of some iron serpent. Stannis's forward boats had no time to swing. The first galley struck the chain near midships and shattered timbers spilled in a crash like oak collapsing in a storm. Men flew. Men shouted and were knocked overboard and clawed at the chain and shouted again in lower voices as they fell away from it. Davos swore on a breath and began to shout orders that other men were already shouting. The Fury's oarsmen hauled in and pushed out, trying to lift her nose over the chain, to ride it like a wave. The chain bit, and for one heartsick moment Robb thought the Fury would shear her own belly open and die like a fish upward with white gut in the sun. Then the prow rose a hand's even measure. The ship slid a yard forward and stuck where she was. The river was all noise now, wood, metal, men. The archers loosed again. The sound of arrows striking a deck is soft and dry. The sounds men make when they receive them are not. The men at the chain winches held their pace steady. The galleys behind the Fury piled up like cards when a careless hand tries to gather them too fast. Lines snapped. Oars tangled. The front ships became a single clumsy beast, and Robb watched men become parts of it against their own will. On the Fury's stern sheets Davos kept yelling and knew as he did that most of what his mouth drifted downwind to kiss nothing anybody could use. He wrenched his head and counted the chain, counted the options. Not many. His eye found the arc of an iron mouth to the left, a smaller chain tower that could be taken by men in a boat if they were foolish and lucky. He caught Stannis's eye and saw something there that he had seen once before, the acceptance that a thing must be done and will be done regardless of the cost to its doer. "Davos," Stannis said over the turmoil. "Take a boat." "No," Davos said. Stannis blinked as if he had not heard. "I will not leave you stuck like a fish," Davos said with a fierceness that surprised himself. "You have a wife and a daughter. If a stray spark catches here, the water will burn and no boat will outrun it." He threw a look toward the walls. "He is not going to burn you." Stannis's eyes slitted at the walls. He saw the longbows, the steady lines, the wolf's head flapping once and again. He saw no green fire. He grunted. "Then we cut. Oars. Chop." Men hauled axes. Men leaned over the side throwing curses down at the place where water met iron. Men reached with hooked blades. The chain, a beast of another man's making, did not care. It did what it had been forged to do. For a time trapped ships bled men into the river. Robb felt his stomach harden and loosen with each bright plume of water that rose where an arrow met it or where a hull shuddered and sighed and belched bubbles. He held the kill-loose-kill pace in his mind the way he had once held the cadence of northern ballads on winter nights. Then Stannis, who could read a battle the way other men read a page, dropped back with 3 ships that hadn't trapped themselves and drove his westward flank against the line of King's Landing's own ships penned to the quays. The Lannister captains, many of them brave at dinner with wine, suddenly had a city's worth of stone above them and the ocean in front of them and a king on their flank, and that was too many things for the bravest man to love at once. The line shivered, then broke. Stannis jammed into the gap, his ship knifing under the shadow of the chain's lesser bite. His second ship followed. The third slewed and kissed a pier and left 2 men pinned shrieking between post and boat with the water making their cries into high bird sounds. "Close sea gates," shouted a man at Robb's elbow, and Robb bared his teeth and did not. "1 more minute. 2. Give them room to run where the arrows could touch them longest." Men died then in numbers great and small, and the battle took on that aspect it always wore after the first asking. The face of a stubborn, ugly work that has to be done. Robb's men along the walls settled into a smooth release, a smooth draw, the rhythm of laborers in a field or coopers in a shed banding barrel after barrel. The shouts below were all chopped into bits and none of them made sentences that could be saved. The Great John roared whenever the Fury's flags dipped and laughed like a man at a table when Stannis' ships cut through 3 of the cities and sent them sliding like children toward the chain. Davos saw a space, a breath, and he took it. "Port!" he bellowed, and the Fury swung her backside into the jail of ships behind. A man in the water grabbed at a rope and then let go when a Northman arrow made a new mouth in his hand, and Davos's heart pulled sideways and down as if it were tethered to that mouth. He kept moving because a ship keeps moving or it dies. He saw a boy lifting a torch on a city quay, wild with some idea, and a man in a stark cloak pushed the boy's arm down gently and shake his head. Stannis noted that, too. The thing in his mouth that had been anger and iron and pure will soften by a breath. "They will not burn us," he said, almost to himself. "They are men." "Wolves," Melisandre said. "Wolves are men with sharper teeth. They are trying not to savage the meat," Davos said dryly, because if he had not said something he might have wept. He had seen the way Robb's archers shot. Careful, cold. The Fury came off the chain like a stubborn fish pulled from a net. She slid into pastures of open water suddenly and took a wide breath. Davos looked at Stannis and saw the decision arrived. "We don't have the city," Stannis said. "We have a harbor in our chests and a chain behind. We withdraw to Dragonstone." "And regroup," Melisandre said at once, but her voice had lost a shred of its velvet. "Regroup," Stannis said. He was more iron in retreat than most men in victory. He fixed the wolf banner with his gaze. "The boy has guts. He does not love the smell of his own cleverness like the Lannister. He means to rule in the north and hold here long enough to wring terms that make his wolf the master of snow and river both." Davos watched the men of King's Landing pulling the chain, his eyes seeing the heave and the counter-heave, and felt a very old weariness settle behind his ribs. Men and their chains. Men and their gates. Robb watched the ships become smaller and smaller, his hand resting now and then on the curve of the parapet as if it could teach him something about being stone. "Don't cheer," he said when the Greyjohn's laughter tried to be something bigger. "This isn't a mummer's tricks. Men went to the bottom here and I do not know their names. They would not know yours," the Greyjohn muttered, chastened, then added on a breath that might have been relief. "But they'll hear it." Tyrion leaned on the wall next to Robb and swirled his empty cup. "You took a city without sacking it and held a harbor without burning it," he said. "You are making enemies in all the places that like their victories simpler." Robb looked east. "Stannis will come again." "He will," Tyrion said, "but not today. Today he knows what you are. Tomorrow he will decide whether to call that good or simply in the way of his purpose." "What would you call it?" Tyrion smiled wearily. "An inconvenience tea. Hat tastes a little like hope." By noon, the city learned the shape of the new day. Word ran faster than horses and lay panting in doorways and under carts by afternoon. Women drew water and gossiped about the boy king behind iron. The fishmongers elbowed one another with a relief that sold good salt fish at bad prices. The gold cloaks looked at their hands and counted their fingers and discovered they still had enough left to take coin and make brave faces. The sept bells rang late prayers for the lost without naming them, and the smell of onions and boiling bones rose like incense from the mother's kitchens because Sansa Stark stood there with her sleeves rolled and her hair bound up, and the mother's men had no thought in them but to obey a young woman who looked at them with a cool, brave kindness as if to refuse would be to confess a cheap soul. Robb walked into that kitchen once and saw his sister giving bread to a boy who would have stolen it yesterday, and for a moment the noise of his own life stilled. "Lady," a man said at the main gate in the afternoon, tugging an iron handbell, "Your Grace," and stumbled over his mouth when the figure in gray edged behind Robb, not quite smiling. Catelyn Stark had the dust of the road on her hem and the steadiness of mountains in her eyes. She had ridden from the river with Bryndon's scouts in the night, and the morning's light had found her at the city's edge. She saw her son and did not cry in the way girls cry, but she let a long breath out and her hand went to his cheek in a single stroke that memory would replay for him at his lowest for years. "You are reckless," she said softly. "I am your son," he said. "And your father's," she added, and that cut in deeper and healed in the same moment. They went together to a chamber that smelled of old wax and ink and had a view of the city's roofs layered like the scales of a metal beast. Gray wind followed and curled along the window as if to watch the pigeons the way men watch their enemies' horse lines. Catelyn told her son what had happened on the Eastern Road where Stannis was gathering, and what had happened on the fords of the Red Fork where Edmure Tully had stood in the teeth of Tywin Lannister's army and held. She told him also what had come from the north. A letter carried by a man with a face that had seen cold and too much. "Winterfell," she said very quietly. The word laid a line of frost down Robb's spine. He took the parchment and read the letters that had been written by a hand he knew and did not know. Theon's hand made self-pleasing and stiff with borrowed authority. He saw the tale of the capture. He saw Ser Roderick's end. He saw the lines that claimed Bran and Rickon had been taken and killed and hung on the gate. He did not notice that he had crushed the parchment until his knuckles ached white. "I sent him," Robb said after a time. The room ticked. "I sent him to Pike to bring his father to us." "You did what a king does," Catelyn said. "He did what a boy does who has never known which family is his until he chose the wrong one." Robb bowed his head. He tried to swallow and the swallow caught halfway. "They might be alive. They might," Catelyn said, not with hope but with stubbornness. She had learned long ago the difference. Tyrion Lannister knocked and did not wait to be invited, which was poor manners and exactly to be expected. He limped in and raised his brow at the tableau. Mother, son, direwolf, sorrow, and a view of a city that had been made and unmade by men who liked their names carved in stone. "I have news," he said, eyeing the parchment in Robb's hand and letting his glance flick to Grey Wind's lip, which was curled enough to show a tooth that would deprive any man of appetite. "And I see that you do as well." "Say it," Robb said without looking up. "Lord Tywin has turned back to the west with half his host," Tyrion said. "He is pushing hard. He is not marching toward us. He is marching toward his meat and comfort. Your uncle Edmure has bloodied him well and made him think better of trying to reach this city with Stannis at its walls and a wolf on its roof." He smiled very faintly. "You have unbalanced the board. Congratulations. A few pieces will fall of their own accord. Some of them will fall in places you did not intend. Tywin's retreat means he will not make terms with Walder Frey to catch us in the back of the knees," the Blackfish said from the doorway where he had listened a moment. "For a time, the twins will be quiet." Catelyn turned her face toward the window. Her voice, when it came, was careful. "Rosalind is waiting," she murmured. "Walder Frey's girl." She cut her gaze at Robb. "You promised him a marriage, my son." Robb's jaw hitched. He had not met Rosalind. He did not know what laugh sounded in her throat or whether she loved the shape of clouds on summer afternoons or hated the taste of apple peel. He did know that a promise made at a river bridge under a lord's shadow was a promise that might save 1,000 men from dying in a slow, ugly way. He felt the ache of the letter in his palm again, and for a moment all the promises he had made in his life felt like stones lying in a sack that someone had asked him to carry up a hill while arrows fell around him. "I will keep it," he said, and the words steadied his chest. "I will wed the Frey girl. If it binds the bridge to the wolf, it is good." Catelyn's face moved as if she had allowed herself one breath and nothing more. "You will be kind to her," she said, and he nodded because the idea that it might be otherwise appalled him in a way that surprised him. He was his father's son and had watched his father set himself the task of being better than other men. They talked of Stannis then, and of the city, and of what would be asked of them in the next days. Tyrion, who took no shame from offering the best advice in the room, suggested a thing that made Robb's skin crawl and his me. "And settle. Parley," Tyrion said. "Send Davos Seaworth a token. Invite him to meet with you between the lines under a banner of truce. He is the only man Stannis listens to who remembers hunger. Speak of prisoners. Speak of justice in the square, not in the dark. Speak of the wolf in the north who wants his snow to be left untrampled." "You think he will grant independence?" the Blackfish said, dry as a frost-laced river. Tyrion shook his head. "No. I think he will grant a truce and take your prisoners into his clean justice and then grind this city with new ships and old stubbornness until something breaks. But in the meantime, you will be gathering men and calling banners, and he will be convincing the Reach to lend him their cauliflowers and roses. In the meantime, your uncle will keep Tywin in a pot too hot to hold, and the twins will nod and grin and count their chickens. In the meantime, you will go north or send men north to answer what you hold in your hand." "Who do we send?" Catelyn asked, and the room grew colder by a degree. "Roose Bolton," said one of the lords by the wall, as if naming cold itself. Robb said nothing. He felt a chill along his wrist that had nothing to do with the shutters being open. Roose Bolton had a voice like a knife eased from a sheath so slowly that a listener felt the idea of the cut before the cut's edge sharpened. He was a good commander. He was a bad man in a way that defied poetry. "No," Robb said. "Not Roose. I'll not give him the north to hold while I hold the south. I will send men I trust and a lord who knows the white knife's turns and could find a path through fell and foin in dark snow." "Wyman Manderley?" the Blackfish suggested. "Stout and steady," Tyrion murmured. "He will fight for bread and a good table. He loves his city more than he loves sleep, and he loves sleep better than most men love glory. He is not for speed." "Galbart Glover," Robb said, thinking. "And Meege Mormont. Mormont will bite the Ironborn on the cheek and spit out the skin." He turned to the Blackfish. "You judge if Edmure can spare men." "He can spare men more easily than he can spare pride," the Blackfish said. "But yes, the fords will hold for a time." Sansa had said nothing. She looked down at her hands and saw a small smear of flour there from the kitchen, as if her past had touched her and left a mark. "Let me speak for our prisoners," she said then, raising her head. The men turned. "For Joffrey and his mother?" the Great John said incredulously, and an ugly grin rippled along his mouth. "For Tommen," Sansa said. "He is a child. He is kind and soft and will be hurt by this whether or not it touches him. I will speak to Stannis for him." Catelyn looked at her daughter for a long moment, as if seeing a woman nested inside the girl she had thought she had brought south to learn how to curtsy and smile and be safe in a world that respected neither curtsy nor smile. "You will sit beside your brother at the parley," she said. "I will speak, and you will speak when it is time." They sent the token to Davos on a small, swift boat with a man who had once smuggled smoked eels between Driftmark and Duskendale for the price of a single cask of beer. The man held the white flag as if it were a fish he meant to sell dear. Davos received it with the respect a sensible man pays to a thing that might mean fewer graves. He carried it to Stannis and spoke, and Stannis frowned at the idea of his face reflected in the eyes of a northern boy and then, after a moment, nodded once. They met on the bank of the river at a place where the mud made a flat that seemed to propose that maybe the world was not all slope and fall. It was noon. The sun pushed light into the water in a way that made a man think of coin in a miser's chest. Davos stood with his hands empty and his eyes open. Robb stood with his sword at his hip and his mother at his side, and Sansa 2 paces behind, and the Blackfish with an archer line at a lazy angle to the river, as if they were only there to draw birds. Stannis came in a boat with 2 oars and a hand on each that belonged to men who would kill for him without debate. He stepped onto the mud, and the mud did not dare to stain his boot. He looked at Robb, and for a moment something like approval flitted in his eyes and then was gone. "You took this city without burning it," Stannis said. His voice was like good steel. "An uncommon gift." Robb nodded. "I could not bear to leave my sister in a sack of ashes," he said. Stannis's gaze flicked to Sansa, then to Catelyn, then back. "I will have the Lannister boys. They are prisoners. They are criminals," Stannis said. "And they are my kin in the way that poisons a man's stew. They will be tried. The woman, too." "There will be no trial," Catelyn said, and her voice cut through all the men's voices like a thread through meat. "Only the same justice your brother received. Headsman's work." Stannis's jaw went tighter. "I will not apologize for my brother's death. He was in the way." "You sent a shadow," Catelyn said, and the word made the air dip. Stannis looked at the place where water kissed mud, his mouth a line. "I sent my will," he said. "I will send it again if I must." Robb stepped half a pace forward. "Try," he said quietly, and the thought of gray wind easing out of shadow deeper unsummoned in his words. Stannis's eyes lifted to the wolf's head snapping at the wall top in the wind. "You do not fear me," he said. It was not a question. "Good. I will still take what is mine." His gaze moved back to Robb's face. "Name your terms." "The North and the Riverlands will be free," Robb said before his breath could ask permission. "We hold what we can hold. We will not kneel to the Iron Throne, whether it stands in this city or Dragonstone or the High Tower's shadow. We will give you the woman and the boy and the other boy when we have them in our hands. In return, you will recognize our rights and leave our lands unwounded by your quarrel." Stannis barked a short laugh. The sound was very nearly rude. "You are a boy," he said. "You have done a man's work, but you speak as if men are in the habit of reshaping kingdoms to suit their hearts. I will not split this realm to satisfy your snow dreaming." He took a step closer. "Bend the knee. Swear me your sword and your river men. I will name you Warden of the North, and you will hold it for your sons and their sons if your blood holds true. You will hunt the Ironborn with my leave and my ships. You will ravage the Westerlands with a justice that will sharpen the appetites of your wolves. And when winter crawls down your walls, you will have my salt and my iron and my tall grain, because you will be my man." "We have been men since we were born," Robb said. "And we have been winter's wardens since the first men carved lines in bark and learned to hang bones on doors to keep out the dead. The North is not a place that can be held for another man. It can only be held or lost. I will not be your warden. I will be my people's king." Stannis' face did not change. It merely seemed to harden further, which was a miracle of sorts. "Then we are at war. We are at truce," Davos said quickly, stepping into the line and cutting his eyes toward Sansa as if to beg her to step forward before blood took the conversation and wrung it dry. "My lord, there are codes." He met Robb's gaze. "You have Joffrey. You have Tommen. Do you have the girl Myrcella?" "She is in Dorne," Robb said. Davos nodded. The gesture acknowledged more than the words. "We will take the boys and the woman when you surrender them and call it a day's work. We will not attack the city for 3 days after, and you—" He held Stannis' eye and let the breath hang there. "You will let him withdraw men to the north to answer an injury done to his house. That is justice enough for a few sons." Stannis sighed, and the sound was like wind under a stone door. He looked at Sansa. "You are his sister?" "Yes," she said, and her voice was lower and more secure than it had been when she had sung in the sept for the Queen's ladies and had been jostled by a woman who had once plucked a lute in a lord's hall and now carried water to make soup taste like more than bones. "I am Sansa Stark of Winterfell. You were to marry my sister's boy." "That was before," she said. "I would not have married him. He is cruel." She breathed in, out, and let the word go like a little bird she had forgotten she had taught to fly. "If you must kill him, my lord, let it be quick and with prayer, not with jeers." She could not keep the remembered sound out of her voice then. The voice of the crowd the day her father died, the faces, the high sharp noises, the way the world had been made of people who wanted to feed themselves with what they could not stomach later. "Please," she said, and for a moment she was a girl again. "Please." Stannis regarded her as if she were a puzzle whose solution might be more complicated than the puzzle looked. "I do not jeer," he said simply. "The law is not mocked in my hall." He looked back to Robb. 3 days. The words came like coins thrown on a table that is already too full. "Send the prisoners tomorrow. We will meet at dawn by the King's Gate." Robb nodded. "We will send them." They went back into the city with the weight of what they had said pressing on their shoulders like straps. That night, Robb did not take his supper with the lords. He ate in a corner with his sister and his mother, and gray wind lay along their feet and made a noise in his throat when anyone came too near. The candle flame shook once when a breeze found a gap in the old window frame, and for an instant Catelyn saw a movement along the edge of the room that made the hair along her arm prick. She remembered a tent, torchlight, a shadow that had not fallen from any man, and a sword that had not been drawn from any sheath, and a throat opening to a breathless scream that would repeat in her ear in mornings years after, if she lived to have years. She stood up. "You will not sleep alone," she said. "I have slept alone for months," Robb said gently. "I can count my own breaths." "You will not sleep alone," Catelyn repeated, and that was the end of it. She and the Blackfish and 2 archers took turns on a chair in the room with the windows, And while the candle did what candles do, the women and men in the city did the small courageous things that make life go on in the teeth of difficult kings. Baked bread, told stories, put a hand on someone's shoulder, went to bed early to make the morning come faster. The shadow came because shadows do not observe truces. It came at the hour when men's dreams turned toward the rooms where they learned what their hands could do. It slid along the line where light fractures against old stone and seemed to hesitate, not because it wanted to but because the room did not recognize it. Gray Wind was on his feet before the men were. He made a sound that belonged to winter and crossed the space where the shadow thought it was safe and closed his mouth on something the eye could not see. The room went colder. Robb woke with an oath and went for his sword, which clanged off its chair and fell and grazed his toe. His howl brought the Blackfish's knife and an arrow cocked. The shadow, and it was a shadow as surely as the boy Joffrey was a boy and a queen thought she was a queen because people told her so, writhed in Grey Wind's jaws like smoke in wind until it came apart with a wet sigh like bad air leaving a sealed room. No one spoke for a moment. The candle guttered. Catelyn crossed the floor and put her hands on her son's face as if to measure the temperature of the thing he had become. "Renly," she whispered. "That is what took Renly." "A demon," the archer muttered, and the Blackfish did not correct him. Robb picked up his sword and stared at the blade for a time as if it had told him a joke without the courtesy of laughing itself. "Stannis will come again," he said. "Men and shadows. He will not accept the North's freedom, and I will not accept his justice. Tomorrow we must accept his prisoners," Catelyn said, "and we must give him ours." The morning was thin and gray. The city had not slept, and it wore the fact like a bruise beneath the eye. They took Joffrey from his chamber with a dozen men. He spat and shouted and threatened, and one of the guards muttered something unwise about cutting the boy's throat to silence him, and Robb turned on him with a look so flat and sharp that the man stumbled back and nearly dropped his spear. "We will be men," Robb said, "whatever they are." Cersei came down the corridor with her hair loose like a flame and her hands bare and rings gleaming. She smiled at Robb as if he had spilled wine on his own boots. She touched Joffrey's hair and smoothed it. She did not look at Sansa. She had perfected that art of looking past. "If you think this will save you," she murmured to Robb, "you are younger than you look." "I will not be saved," Robb said, and understood as he said it that the words were true in both senses they offered. He would be victory or he would be bones in cold ground, and the song would place him more kindly than the truth could afford. There wasn't a third thing. He had known that when he'd let the gate open for him last night. He had known it longer. He looked at her and thought how much grief lies in a woman who cannot bear to be told no. They walked to the king's gate in a procession of banners and hard faces. The city had gathered on roofs and in alleys. The mother's men stood in their gray. The gold cloaks stood with their spears in a trembling line as if their hands belonged to someone else and that someone had a better breakfast. Sansa walked beside her brother and kept her eyes straight and her mouth a line that would not break whatever stones were thrown at it. Stannis stood waiting with Davos and a handful of his men, who looked like they had been peeled from the wood of his ships and shaped by salt. He held himself without ostentation, which was a kind of ostentation. He watched as Joffrey and Cersei were brought forward. Joffrey jerked his shoulder free of a guard's hand with a jerk that would have been funny if the city had not been so full of men without arms. The exchange took a dozen breaths. Stannis nodded. Davos nodded. Men with good eyes and bad hearts checked lists and looked over shoulders as if expecting the trick that would make everything make sense. No trick came. Cersei's gaze cut quick as a cat's to Sansa and away. Joffrey turned his mouth toward the crowd to spit, and a dried apricot pit hit him on the cheek from somewhere, and the sound it made, the tiny sound, made Sansa feel suddenly for that unknown hand's owner with a love she could not have explained if her life depended on it. "By whose law?" Stannis said to no one and everyone. "Was the previous king crowned?" "By a lie," Davos muttered. Stannis ignored him, which was the kindest thing he could do. "You will have the boy's head?" the Great John asked at Robb's shoulder in a voice he was trying to keep low. Stannis heard it anyway. His ears were not for show. "I will have the law," Stannis said. "His head will be a part of that law. It will not be the only part, and it will not be the part one enjoy. The work of kingship is not a mummer's show. He looked at Robb with a stillness that did not soothe. We will leave you your 3 days. Use them, bury your dead from yesterday, or marry your bridge. Robb nodded and let a breath out slowly the way a man does when he is lowering a heavy cask from a cart and must not crush his toes. Stannis turned with his prisoners and went. The crowd had nothing to throw that would change what would come. They threw their eyes. That was all they had. The 3 days were spent like coin borrowed from a man you did not like and would have to face later. Orders went north to Galbart Glover and Meege Mormont. Ride, gather, sail where possible, cut where necessary, make the spears of the Ironborn ring with their own blood. A rider peeled off for White Harbor. Wyman Manderley would move for bread and for honor and for the chance to remind the realm that fat men can be brave when they must. Another rider went to the Twins, carrying a pledge written in Robb's hand that set Roslin's name in ink thicker than some men's blood. Another rider slipped west to Edmure bearing praise, supplies he had not asked for, and 2 clean shirts from Sansa's own hands because she had remembered once a story of a knight who had thought he had been forgotten by his kin until a small thing arrived to tell him he had not. Little letters and big ones, men and women, carts of onions, sacks of oats, bolts of cloth. The city flexed and found a new shape. On the 2nd day, a rumor ran like a rat that the boys shown to the small folk at Winterfell had not been Bran and Rickon but Miller's sons charred into rumors. Catelyn took the rumor in her hands, turned it over and put it back down, because a rumor is a thing that gives hope to fools and she would not be a fool again. She prayed in the September anyway. She prayed at a window too, looking north where the sky lies lower. She prayed over her son's sleeping face and hesitated. Men's faces when they sleep look like the boys they were when they thought a cold morning was the worst thing a day could give them. On the 3rd day, men set up the poles for the king's justice in the square outside the September. Stannis's men had built gallows before. They did it quickly and without enjoying it so much that the gods would note it. Joffrey shrieked when he saw, but quietly, because his mouth remembered where it was. Cersei kept her mouth level until the last possible moment, and then she said something to Stannis under her breath that made the point of his jaw shift. Davos caught only on. "E word, sister." He was not sure if she meant his or hers or the one they had both lost to bad fortune and worse love. The heads fell quick. The prayer was short. The city was very, very quiet afterward, the way a house is quiet after the crockery has been smashed and the men have gone outside to breathe. Sansa went back to the mother's kitchen and cut bread until her hands ached and she could not tell whether the ache was bone or grief. Robb walked the walls and did not look outward or inward. He looked along stone. The Blackfish sent riders out the Rose Road and the Gold Road like a man shaking a cloth before folding it and putting it away. Stannis took his ships east in the afternoon sun. His prisoners delivered to the mother's silent sisters for a day and then to deep ground. He had what he wanted for the day. He would want more tomorrow. When the city slept, Littlefinger rode through a postern gate with a hood over his head and counted the changes in his head with the cold pleasure of a man who knows that a board reset means everyone's debts have to be recalculated. Varys watched him slip by and made no noise. Later, he went to the dungeons and stood before Tyrion's cell and put his hands together like a man who has been taught to pray and asks the gods to excuse him from the words this time. "You did well," he said. "I always do," Tyrion said cheerfully. He was eating a plum with exaggerated relish, sucking at his sticky fingers. "It seldom matters. It matters to the dead," Varys said softly, and for a moment his face looked raw under all its veils. "Tell me what you will do now." "I will help our wolf make better mistakes," Tyrion said. "And I will find a fast ship when he does not need me and go somewhere men are bad at recognizing dwarfs by the cut of their nose." Varys smiled like a cat that had remembered where it had hidden a little bird for later. "And I," he said, "will write a letter to a girl with silver hair and a dragon's name about how the game has paused and what pieces were taken in the last move. It is good for her to know when the board breathes." In the morning, the gates stood open and carts rolled out. Galbart Glover hugged Robb and called him boy and king in the same breath and made a face like a man who had tasted honey he did not deserve. Meege Mormont clapped him on the shoulder with a blow that left a print and said, "We bring you back your home or we die on the road so near it that you will smell the smoke." Robb nodded and felt both better and worse for the words. He walked to the yard where Sansa stood in an old cloak of their mother's that she had found at the bottom of a chest in some forgotten chamber. The cloak smelled faintly of snow and rose oil. Gray wind rubbed his face against her knuckles and huffed. She grinned weakly and bent to kiss his nose. Robb watched and thought the sight alone could keep a man warm. "Do you remember when Arya beat the stable boy at Styx?" Sansa asked suddenly, not looking at him. "I remember the way Father tried not to smile," Robb said. Sansa nodded. "I want to remember the way he tried not to smile, not the rest." "It will soften," Robb said, and it was the only lie he allowed himself that day. The weeks that came after were made of work and words and the slow feeling of a city adjusting to the weight of a different hand. Men grumbled about bread and then were surprised by an onion and then were embarrassed by their own surprise and decided to postpone their rebellion until after supper. The gold cloaks learned how to take orders from men whose names they had not practiced growing up. The small folk learned new appointments for old offices and then forgot and then learned again. Robb received lords who offered reed-thin promises and flatteries. He received letters filled with words like ice and oath. He received riders whose horses had died under them. He received a boy who swore he had seen wolves hunting south of salt pans with eyes like lanterns. "Not your wolves," the boy kept saying, crossing himself in a tangle that covered all 7 gods and a few older ones. Robb listened and put more men to patrolling. He had learned that a crowned head is a head where everybody puts their fear first and asks questions later. Walder Frey's reply came in a packet that smelled of old spice and new dust. Rosalind was described in terms that made her sound like a piece of river lapis. Fair, polished, valuable, common. Walder's hand showed in the flourishes that broke apart and forgot themselves halfway through. There were conditions. There were always conditions. Robb signed to them. He did not mind a shiver of pride in thinking that the old vulture had been denied his favorite feast of grievance. He did mind the thought of the North under iron boots while he learned what his wife liked for breakfast. He decided he would learn quickly. Stannis sent letters. They were short. They were honest. They were a little cruel. He denounced Robb's presumption and his childishness and his treason and then, at the end of each letter, added a line in his own hand that read, "When the North is rid of Krakens, I will answer you." It was as close as he could come to grace. Davos wrote a letter separately that said simply, "I am sorry for your brothers. I have boys too." Robb read that letter twice and then folded it away and carried it with him in a pocket inside his jerkin for 3 days before he felt foolish and gave it to Sansa to keep or burn as she pleased. She did neither. She tucked it into a book Sansa had in her chamber by the window that had a view of the sea and reread it when her breath would not settle at night. The Hound left on a morning that smelled of olive smoke and the river. He came to Sansa's door as he had once, and this time she opened it with 2 guards, not 6, and did not flinch. He leaned in the doorway, huge, singed, half smiling in a way that was not kind and not cruel. "You'll not need me to keep pigs from you," he said. "We have men for that," Sansa said. "You had men for it before," he said. She nodded and dropped her gaze and then raised it again. "Will you go to the Riverlands?" "I'll go to where there isn't fire," he said. "And if there is, I'll go on again." He scratched his jaw. "Your brother is a fool and a king." "He is both," Sansa agreed. "Keep a knife under your pillow," the Hound said and went. Time began to fold like cloth put away for a season. Robb no longer counted days in the city by the bells but by letters from the north. First rumors, then reports. Meege Mormont seizing Torrhen Square, Galbart Glover lifting men from the ruins and putting spears in their hands. A raid that burned 10 iron longships where they lay with their bellies full of wheat. A girl with a spear in her hand who killed a raider and grinned with a mouth full of blood that was not her own. Winterfell became a word that made men's faces change. In his dreams, Robb saw its walls red with sunset and white with frost and charred black where Theon's men had made up bodies and burned them into lies. The day Rosalind Fry arrived in King's Landing, the city rain was the kind that turns a man's hat into a puddle and then laughs at him when he picks it up and puts it back on. She came in a cart that had lost one wheel and had been fixed with a length of green wood that creaked like old bones. She had a quiet face that made you think of small flowers growing where no one would look for them, and she had a stubborn line to her mouth. She looked at Robb with a frankness that made him want to be a better person than the person who had been himself that morning. Her father's cousin smiled too broadly, like a man who thinks he has won a private game at a public table. He looked around for places to put the blame he had kept in his saddlebags. When all the ceremonies were done, when Catelyn had kissed her son on the brow and told him he was doing what was needed and Rosalind was calm with her hands folded over what courage she had, when the bread had been salted and the wine poured and the old gods and the new had been invoked for once in their busy lives to do more than decorate, Robb found himself standing beside a girl who kept glancing toward the windows as if wanting to remember how the light fell in this city on this day in this hour. He thought of another girl, one who loved songs and believed the world could be arranged like flowers in a careful cup, and he looked at the wife he had promised and whispered something ordinary about the taste of the cake. She smiled. He saw in that smile the future. Not bright, not simple, not the thing he had wanted when he had sat in pines above the King's Road and thought he knew what heroism was. The thing he saw looked like work. He liked the look of it. Tywin Lannister returned to the Westerlands and claimed he had never left. He called his banners again, not because he loved banners but because he loved victory. He wrote to 100 men who loved gold more than sons and planted little knots of treachery at turnings where men slowed their horses. Some of the knots took, some did not. He wrote to Walder Frey and received a letter in reply that smelled of sweet meat and the pleasure of grievance deferred. He ground his teeth. He made plans that involved knives at tables and musicians who never hit a wrong note, and there was no song to be played in the world for them now that the city was in a wolf's hands, and his splendid plan would leave him the man who had murdered a king who had treated a city with a mercy that even Stannis had been forced to nod to. He set that plan aside and made another and then another. He did not lack for ideas. He lacked for time. Stannis rebuilt. He built ships as if ships were prayers. He glowered at the Reach and sent letters to High Garden that were perfectly correct and perfectly insulted every vanity Mace Tyrell kept in his fat bones. Olenna Tyrell read them and laughed and told her son to wait, which he was good at in all things save pastry. Loras went to a quiet place and tried not to remember the shape of a man's mouth when he kissed it for the last time. He failed. He sharpened his blade and told himself that a sword is a patient friend. Far north of all this, a boy in black saw white eyes in a forest and felt a truth slide into a part of him that had always been a hole. That there are wars that will not be sung of because men won them by being cold on a wall and not dying when it would have been easier to die. Bran Stark slept in roots and in a great gray body and learned the names of ravens. Arya Stark was a shadow under hedges and a voice with different names. She said them at the right time, and when the wrong man asked, she said nothing at all, and when the right man asked, she gave him a name he deserved to wear only once. The world moved along lines Robb could not see, and he had the sense now and then that his victory here had been the one that left doors open to places where men would need to go. Years later, if years were left for telling, men would tell the story in different ways. Some would say that the wolf took the city because a gate captain loved his children. Some would say he took it because the dwarf had a craft that could be stolen and the wolf had hands that could hold it. Some would say he held it because he chose not to burn it. Some would say he held it because he had a sister and loved her in a way that made him remember not everything a king may do is a thing a man can live with. Each would be wrong and each would be right and each would miss the part that held the rest together. That men kept their oaths long enough for other men to keep theirs. Robb stood on the ramparts in the evening and felt the sea wind lift the hair at his forehead and heard the scratch of gray wind's paws on stone. "You did well," the Blackfish said, coming to stand beside him. "Today." "Tomorrow," Robb said. "Tomorrow," the Blackfish. H agreed, and they watched the light go. The city's candles pricked out, one by one, and somewhere in a place of cloth and levity a singer tuned a harp and tried a song for which there were not yet words.